Judges, I present to you our last group here today, Ottawa University.
All right, initially addressing our question about the FDIC $250,000 limit for Silicon Valley Bank's failure. We wanted to define first the rule of law versus rule of man. Initially, the rule of law, we figure, is political philosophy that all citizens and institutions within a country, state, or community are accountable to the same laws, including leaders. We also have a quote from our reader that the law is simple, clear, precise, and I can't do that. And if you attempted to make the law religious, fraternal, equalizing, philanthropic, industrial, literary, or artistic, you will then be lost in an uncharted territory, which is from the law, page 53. Our definition for the rule of man: a type of personal rule in an unaccountable, rebounded society where rules change from ruler to ruler. In this sense, we have tyranny, or commonly known, we can see communism in the fact where we see South Korea or North Korea, their leaders. Jumping into our problem, we'd like to address the political issues first. On page 45 of our reader, we do have a quote from Hayek. It says, if individuals are to allow effective plan making, predictable actions by the state must be determined by fixed rules independent of the circumstances. In finding this, we can see that this case should not be bailed out for all these investors because they took on that risk of the $250,000 limit by going over that. So if we are to abide by the rule of law, we can see that in this definition and this quote that we will not be needing to refund up to the amount of that for this failure. Another issue we have is good laws are implied by the ideal of the rule of law that are general and equal. This is important for entrepreneurship since pre-selection is not possible for them. A lot of the bank accounts that were opened with Silicon Valley Bank were run by startup businesses for that entrepreneurship. So if they were knowing about this law, and we can assume that they knew, pooling all of their money into one bank was not smart for them, but they did take on that risk as we previously stated. Finally, our economic privileges and restrictions require a maintenance of the rule of law that can protect political and economic arbitration by the government. So in this sense, we can see that the laws may have needed to be updated to account for this change or this drastic measure that had taken place with Silicon Valley Bank.
So philosophically, right, you're looking at the idea of whether or not the government ought to exceed the 250,000 mark, and really the idea here is that it's not immoral to not pay them out beyond that $250,000 limit, because the people who put their money into the banks were rational actors. They knew what they were doing. They could have put their money into another bank and then gotten, $500,000. So they knew the risk that they were entering when they put their money into the banks. And what is immoral is the government going back on its word, right? Turning the law into something arbitrary, or political, because the law is supposed to be simple, clear, concise. It's supposed to remain consistent, right? And then so you have the idea that, right, when the government, if they did decide to exceed that $250,000 amount, right, they're going to engage in things like that. Basia explains, right, the legal plundering, and then they're going to increase taxes on the people who did not put extra money in there, and then take it from them to give it to other people, right, redistributing that wealth. And so that is immoral, and what isn't immoral is the government remaining consistent and keeping that 250,000 limit, because everybody knew what that limit was prior to them putting the money in.
When looking at the economic side of things, you have two options. You can bail the bank out to try and prevent a recession, or if you do bail the bank out, what you could end up doing is something far worse, which is putting into place incentives that promote bad business plans because they know they will be bailed out. So they're just looking to get consumers into the bank. When you look at David Harper talks about rule of law. He said the rule of law is distinguished from the rule of man because the rule of man is arbitrary forms of government. So for them to say in this case we would be bailing out the banks, even though there was a preset FDIC limit of $250,000 that would be insured, that would be an arbitrary form of a government decision. So it would go directly against the rule of law. When you look at Hayek's views on the rule of law, he said it is necessary for a rule of law to take, or it is necessary to have rule of law if you want economic freedom and flourishing. When you look at what promotes economic growth, you need a stable, predictive environment. When you have government making arbitrary laws and regulations that favor one side over the other, that puts businesses in a tricky situation because they don't know what to expect in the future. And when they do this, that will prevent some businesses from going into or from ever starting up because they don't want to take on those risks. And it'll also promote things like monopolies because when you have regulations that favor one over the other, it creates barriers to entry. And due to things like this that have happened, that is why we have to put in more regulations like the Sherman antitrust laws that are to break up monopolies, that are things that are created by the rule of man type laws that are arbitrary and favor one over the other. So if the government were to do this, they would be putting at risk all the other, or an even bigger recession, because if all the banks would go along with this idea that it doesn't matter what business practices we do, we will be bailed out. You will see them taking on much more risk than they should, and that will continue to grow and grow until there's a run on all the banks, and then where would we be left with? So it is for these reasons that we must stick by the rule of law and not bail out these banks. Thank you for your time.
Wait,
Maybe you have questions.
Q&A time, Q&A time.
My favorite part.
This is the thing.
Yeah, sorry. Yes.
So from your comments, do you think this effect will have a ripple effect? Other banks will have the same situation if we don't focus on the rule of law, then we'll be overruled by the rule of man. What's your comment on that?
So yes, I think it will have a ripple effect if we do bail out the banks, because I think those other banks will say, well, they bailed them out, they'll bail us out. So they'll be willing to take on more unnecessary risk rather than sticking with a solid business plan, because like the reason they do take on that risk is because it adds profit when it works out. But when it doesn't, and they know they have somebody else that will bail them out, it's worth the risk in those points. So it would be incentivizing a lot riskier business actions than what they should be involved in.
So what are some of the incentives that will cause the government to break its own rule and bail out the depositors? Like, why would the government want to do that?
So the main one would be to prevent a recession. So it is very possible that we could go into recession by not bailing out this bank, because everybody is going to stop putting their monies into banks, and then investing isn't going into other projects to promote the economic growth that we would like to see. However, I feel if we do this, it could create a much worse problem down the road where all the banks could be in a bad position and there could be a run on multiple banks, which would cause a much worse recession than if we just dealt with the problem right now.
The government has already set a precedent of bailing out certain banks. Does the fact that they've set that precedent have any bearing on this particular case?
In my opinion, no. When you look at, I think you have to draw the line somewhere. And so once they did that, I think this would just be, like I said, continuing the behavior that banks can get involved in risky businesses, and the government is going to get them out. I also do think there is a difference in some of the banks that had been bailed out in the past due to them being half government, half private businesses such as Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac. So I do think that could play a factor in why possibly those ones were bailed out and why I believe the one, or Silicon Valley Bank should not be bailed out.
I think a large precedence on this was more towards regional banks. I don't think those smaller, more local banks are gonna be able to get that bailout because they don't have as much money, the government's not gonna look to them as much as to see how big of that impact is gonna be. These regional banks have much more funding, many more clients, and we've already seen these two banks in Silicon Valley and then the following one, both were the second largest ones that we've seen fail since 2008.
I also think that, like, with specifically in regards to the precedent, right? Like, we've seen the effects of what bailing out those banks before did, and we've seen like the negative impacts. And so, just because it is prior precedent, that doesn't mean that we should continue with that when we can see that the outcomes were not what we wanted.
And speaking on a philosophical view of this, with Silicon Valley Bank being purely a privately owned business, I do not think it would be morally permissible to use taxpayer money to bail them out when they were involved in risky business.
Quick point of clarification, I want to make sure I got you right. So, the immoral act of bailing out people who have deposits greater than $250,000 is the fact that that decision would be arbitrary, correct?
Not only that it would be arbitrary, but the fact that it would be, I mean, that is part of it, because that is a big part of it, because then you're asking, well, why do they get bailed out and why aren't we bailing out these other businesses? But it is also immoral because the people who invested over the 250,000 FDIC limit knew that beforehand and took on that risk. So it'd be the same as me asking, well, if I invest in my Roth IRA and I have a loss for a year, how come I'm not getting bailed out?
So it's unfair.
Which is with the arbitrary, which is why that is part of it.
Okay, so it's unfair because it's the rule of man, basically.
Correct.
But wasn't the initial determination of we would bail out people up to 250 equally as arbitrary and unfair?
Original, no, and I will tell you why. Because it was preset before any of this happened. So it's not like we're making this law after the fact of the circumstances. Now, I'm not saying that when they are making it, it does not favor banking, but at the same time, it was done before there were any I guess, runs on banks and stuff, or it was done in order to prevent runs on banks. But in doing so, I would consider it arbitrary, and I do believe it does promote riskier businesses, like offering higher interest rates. But the fact that the law is already in place, I think you have to uphold it, just because people have invested their money under that assumption. And when you look at things like economic freedom, I think that would go against like the predictability of the market when you're taking something like that out of it that's been there for so long. And it was for consumers at least, because if they're investing or saving their money, they're doing that under the pretenses that it is insured up to $250,000. And I think taking it away from them would not be right, would not be moral.
So the rule of man is okay if it occurs before the incident, so I can form stable expectations.
Correct.
Well, and you also have the idea, like, sort of in Leviathan, where the government has this obligation, like a moral obligation, to protect security and like the economy, right? And so this wasn't a after the fact decision. This was like preset, pretense decision that like this is what we're going to do in order to secure the economy, right? And so it's rule of man in the sense that like it was arbitrary, but it is rule of law because that is what the purpose of the state was meant to do, right? And then the people who exceeded the $250,000 amount, right? They were rational. They knew what they were doing when they put more than that amount into their bank accounts. And so it's not the government's decision. I think we could mostly all agree that it would be nice if the government had the money to, like already had the money and could give people extra money beyond that $250,000. But it's not what they are obligated to do morally, right? What they are obligated to do and what they should do is keep to that $250,000 amount.